We did look at this passage not long ago, but I was having a conversation with a fellow pastor this week, and we were talking about how rich the Bible is. How you can study and study and study, and it never really loses its... There's always something new to find. There's always something new to find. And I was given an analogy. They weren't... the person who was talking to me wasn't intending to give this analogy, but I think it works really well. They were amazed at... they're interested in geography and map making and things like that, and they had brought up the point that it's almost impossible to do a completely accurate map of the world, especially when you get to coastlines. Coastlines always get bigger. They're always bigger than you think they are. Coastlines are always bigger than you think they are. Have you ever seen a map of Canada, how much coastline there is involved in our country? Huge amounts, especially when you get further north and you get into all those islands just north of the sort of mainland in Canada. They all have all these, and if you look at a really detailed map, you'll see all the little inlets and fjords and all these little bits and pieces, all the intricate detail on the islands. And you might think, well, we can tell exactly how much coastline we have in Canada. We'll just take maybe a tiny little a ruler, or maybe we'll take a piece of string and run it around the coastlines, and we'll find out exactly how much coast there actually is. But measuring a coastline is a problem of resolution. It's a problem of resolution. Because if we were, let's say we were up 75,000 feet above the earth, and we measured the coastline of Canada, we would get an answer. I don't know what the answer to that, how long it is, but we'd get an answer. Well, what if we came down, say, 50,000 feet to 25,000 feet? Well, the way you would see that coastline would change. There would be things at 25,000 feet that you could not see at 75,000 feet. There were little sections that you thought were a straight line that actually go in little wiggly curves, but because you were higher up, it looked like a straight line. So when you come down to 25,000 feet, you now see that some of your lines that were straight should have been curved, so there's actually more distance than you thought you saw higher up. Well, what if we came down another, say, 15,000 feet to 10,000 feet? The same thing would happen again, right? Parts that looked like they were straight lines, you now see that there was detail there you couldn't see higher up. See, this is the problem with measuring a coastline. You can always get closer and find out there were contours to the coastline you couldn't see further up. Until you get down to the point where those grains of sand you couldn't distinguish are actually not straight lines at all. The beach, have you ever been to one of those long beaches, maybe up at Pancake Bay, where you see the curve of the beach as it goes? It kind of looks like a straight line if you go up higher, but you get to a certain point, you begin to see the curves. The problem with measuring coastlines is, no matter how well you think you've done, there is more detail to be found if you just look closer. I thought, wow, that's a great illustration of how the Bible works. I can read you a verse of scripture like John 3:16, right? For God so loved the world that he gave his one and only Son, that whoever believes in him will not perish but have everlasting life. I learned that as a child, probably 4, 5, 6 years old. Did you know that that verse means more to me now than it did then? Because as I've gotten closer and closer and closer, it's gotten deeper, it's gotten richer, the meaning has sunk into my soul. If you've ever struggled, if you've ever had hardship or heartache, if you've ever seen the power of sin to corrupt and destroy and kill, if you've seen that firsthand, you will now understand the power of God's love more fully, more richly, in deeper depth of field, and with more color than you did before as a child. You understood those things. Kids can't understand it. I remember as a kid thinking, why do families break up? Why do moms and dads not stay together? Don't you just commit to loving one another and just, say, I'm not going to let this bother me? I'm now in my mid-40s. I understand the challenge of staying together in a relationship. Ask my wife. I am intolerable. And yet she's still there. Because as we have grown, we have learned what it means. As we read in the book of Colossians, actually. Because Christ loved us and forgave us, we also ought to forgive one another. So the Bible gets richer and deeper the more you learn, the closer you get. So I have no problem preaching the same passage every few weeks. I promise, here's my promise to you, okay? I won't try your patience. We won't do it all the time. But I would like you to consider something different that we heard a couple weeks ago, but we didn't really meditate on. We talked about the fact that Jesus has come to reconcile God to his creation. Jesus has come. We said in verses 21 and 22, once you were alienated from God and were enemies in your minds because of your evil behavior. But now he has reconciled you by Christ's physical body through death to present you holy in his sight, without blemish and free from accusation. We considered that. The fact that Jesus has come to reconcile us to God. And he's the one we've been longing for. Jesus, God is the one we've been longing for. In him we find something that we can't find anywhere else. But I want to read what we saw just before that in Colossians. And I want us to hear the grace in these verses. Let me back all the way up to Colossians 15, and then we're going to focus in on 19 and 20. Paul writes, he is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn over all creation, for by him all things were created. Things in heaven and on earth, visible and invisible, whether thrones or powers, rulers, authorities. All things were created by him and for him. And I want to pause right here because there's something for all of this passage we're going to need to understand. And if we miss this point, we're not going to hear everything Paul's trying to say to us. Paul is, ethnically speaking, a Hebrew. He's a Jew. And even more than that, Paul is, religiously speaking, trained as a leader in the Hebrew religion, in Judaism. Paul says, I had all the rules memorized, and I did them better than everyone else. I followed the rules, Paul says elsewhere in his letters. If anyone wants to boast about what a good Hebrew, what a good Jew they were, I can beat them at that. I can boast more. I was better because I gave everything I had, everything I was. I gave it to the practice of the Hebrew religion. I was a religious Jew, period. I was the prototype. So Paul coming, he is ethnically Jewish, but he is also deeply religious, and he understands the Hebrew religion. And when he speaks, he's speaking from the Old Testament, not just as sort of a distant sort of, you know how we sometimes talk about the Bible in the West today, in North America? You hear people say, God bless you, and the conversation that led up to that, you wonder if they've really ever met God or know who he is. Because it's sort of a cultural thing rather than being a real heart thing. People have those little fish bumper stickers, although I don't see them nearly so much anymore. But you see the fish bumper sticker on the bumper of the person who just cut you off in traffic and was yelling at you. You wonder, is the fish a cultural thing rather than a heart thing? That's not Paul. Paul says, to the very depth of who I was and am, I knew the God of the Old Testament. And the reason that's so important for us is, did you just hear what he said about Jesus? He said he is the image of the invisible God. The image of the invisible God. And what Paul is actually saying there is not just some copy or reflection. When you see Jesus, you see what God looks like. An exact image. An imprint. We have, when I worked at TD, when I was a bank teller, we used to have stamps, the teller stamps, that we'd put it on. And the intent was the teller stamp was carved out so that when you pressed down on it, it would leave a stamp that was the official mark. Here is the date. Here is where this document was entered in. And every time you stamped on it, it wrote exactly what it was supposed to say, and it was official. And it said, you've been to the bank today. You handed it to the teller. Here is the record. Here is the imprint. This marks this transaction as being official. And it wasn't, sometimes I'd stamp it and say one thing, and sometimes I'd stamp it and say... No, it was exactly the representation of the official stamp, the seal, that we put on that document. And when you see Jesus, it's not an approximation. It's not God is like this. When you see Jesus, he is the image, the exact image of the invisible God. He is human the way humans were meant to be. Because remember, if we go back all the way to Genesis, we see at the creation, let us create mankind in our, what's the word? Image. Jesus is what we were meant to be as a reflection of who God is. But even more than that, it says, Paul says, that all things were created in heaven and earth, visible and invisible, whether thrones or powers or rulers or authorities, all things were created by him and for him. Now, if you've read the Old Testament, you'll know that that can apply to only one person in the Old Testament. Who is it? God. It has to be God, right? Because so much of Israel's history was them reaching out to other beings or other names that they claimed would come and be their help. And God said, no, I am Yahweh. I am the Lord your God. Besides me, there's no one else beside me. There's no one like me. I am the one who spoke and creation came into being. I am the one who made all things. So for Paul, there's no way to say that Jesus is the one who through things all was made. Jesus is the one for whom everything was made and by whom everything was made, without connecting him to the God who is alone, singular, the one who is worthy of our praise. Paul is this, it almost sounds like a throwaway statement. Paul says so much in this verse that we just read. Paul says he is before all things, and in him all things hold together. He is the head of the body, the church. He is the beginning and firstborn from among the dead. It's important to understand when he says firstborn, he's not talking about order of, like, birth order. I know that's what we would typically think of when we think of firstborn. I am the firstborn. However, I like the idea that Paul has here better than just birth order, because in Hebrew culture, firstborn meant special and privileged. I tried to explain this to my brothers and sisters, and they will not listen. There was a special inheritance. There was a special place in the family for the firstborn. Jesus is not firstborn in the sense that he's older than we are. Jesus is firstborn in the sense that he holds a place that none of us holds beside him. As Jesus is raised from the dead, he is singular in the sense that he is the Son of God. By who he is, we become sons and daughters of God because of who he is. Either way, it's all about him. God was pleased. Now let me continue on verse 19 here. For God was pleased to have all his fullness dwell in him, and through him to reconcile to himself all things. Let me read that again. I want you to listen to what I just read. Listen to it. For God was pleased to have all his fullness dwell in him, and through him to reconcile to himself all things, whether things on earth or things in heaven, by making peace through his blood shed on the cross. We are longing for peace, whether we realize it or not. At the men's retreat last weekend, my last message, I preached a message of fighting. I said, guys, we need to be able to fight. We looked at David, and it says David went to a particular place, and he fought a battle there, and then he began to build and to create and to nurture. He built things. He created things. He nurtured. He was called the shepherd of God's people, Israel. Men, we need to learn what it means to build. We need to learn the beauty and joy we can find in creation. And men, we need to learn how nurture becomes part of who nurture satisfies something inside of us. You need to nurture. Not only do other things need your nurture, but you, as a person, need to learn how to nurture. I think there's something deeply rooted in us. What was the first? This was a joke, but it's only partly a joke. Do you know the first profession ever? It's gardening. The first job ever, the first profession ever was as a gardener. Jesus, he was there. We just read it in Colossians. He just wasn't Jesus yet. He was the Son of God. But God, in the very beginning, says to the human beings, what does he say to them? Look at all the beautiful things I've made. Go take care of the garden. Nurture is built into who you are. And I think it's easier to preach creation and nurture because they sound like such positive things. Such positive things, right? Who doesn't love creating a beautiful poem or a wonderful song or woodworking or writing a short story or going into the kitchen and baking a cake, and when you're finished, you've made all those fine... Have you ever seen the realistic looking cakes that look like other stuff? It's art. It's very short-lived art, but it's art. There's something wonderful about creation that satisfies some longing in our soul. There's something beautiful about nurture. When we were at the men's retreat, we took tomatoes from our garden, we cut them up, we served them on the sandwiches. I said, I worked hard and look, we can see the fruit of my labor. This was a nurturing thing where I had to go pull the weeds and stake up the tomatoes and all those things. And there's something fulfilling about nurturing and seeing growth and seeing fruit. There's something beautiful about that. But I said, guys, there's also a time where we need to fight. Because we live in a world where battle becomes essential so that the darkness doesn't overcome the light and the evil doesn't win over good. There's a certain sense in which living in this world entails necessarily fighting battles that need to be fought. There are battles you will need to fight. I think one of the problems is, and ladies, I'm sure you experience this as well, but I can only speak as a man, there's a time where the battle becomes the thing we love and long for, where we celebrate the fight and not the things we're fighting for. It's a real danger there. Because what we actually long for, what you're actually looking for, is peace. Jesus becomes God's reconciler. Through him, he is reconciling to himself all things, whether things on earth or things in heaven, and making peace through his blood shed on the cross. Now again, I'm going to call you back to the fact that Paul is writing as a Hebrew, as an Israelite, as someone who knows the Old Testament. And for those of you who haven't been here very often, or maybe you're new here, maybe you're visiting us this morning, you will know, you won't know this because you haven't been here to watch my sermons. But every time I mention the word peace, the rest of those people who are sitting beside you are now really settling in because they know what they're about to hear. I say this all the time. Peace for the Old Testament is not just no fighting going on. In the Old Testament, in the Hebrew understanding of the word peace, it is more than just no hostility, no fighting. It's not just stopping something. Peace is the presence of something else. And I can illustrate this. I've already alluded to the challenges we have in marriage, with the challenges we have in any relationship, really. But again, I think it comes to a special point in marriage because you have to live and get along with the person you're married to. Nobody wants a marriage where there are problems and there is tension, but you just don't talk about it. Right? Do you want to be in a relationship where there's constant tension?
No.
No. Thank you. Peace in a home does not mean we ignore and just don't fight about the stuff that's wrong. That's not peace. For some of us, as adults, we've had to learn how to deal with conflict because in our homes as children, what we saw was just avoidance. Do you know what I mean by that? There's stuff that's wrong, we just don't talk about it. Avoidance is not peace. I remember growing up and listening to the news, the reiteration by politicians over and over again, we do not negotiate with terrorists. We do not negotiate with terrorists. We do not negotiate with terrorists. And think about that for a second. The reason you don't negotiate with terrorists is because giving terrorists what they want is not the creation of peace. It's the appeasing of violent people until there's something else they want. Right? If you give in to violence and just take whatever you're asking for, just leave us alone, that is not the establishment of peace. That is actually the reinforcement of violence as a means to an end. Right? Parents, if you give your kids the things they're asking for when they throw a temper tantrum, what are you teaching them to do? Throw temper tantrums, right? For the Bible, peace is not just ignoring or avoiding or appeasing. Peace is when everything fits together and things are the way they were meant to be. And what a huge difference that is. To bring it back to the home situation, one of the things that parents can do really, really importantly for their kids is when they have arguments, because you will have arguments, show your kids the resolution of arguments alongside the conflict that came. Show your kids that I can say, I disagree with you fully, but I love you. And my love for you is bigger than my desire to be right all the time. Teach them how to fight. Teach them how to bring peace back into a home. God says, through Jesus, I am bringing peace, and the world is becoming what it was made to be. Don't you long to see that in your life? Don't you long to see that in your work, in your home, in your relationships? We prayed for a number of people with medical needs. I think medical needs are they're a signpost for us. I think that's why the Gospels are full of stories of Jesus healing people physically. Because it's a signpost to something deeper, something greater, something that Jesus is going to do in the future that we can only sort of imagine right now. You are at war with your body. It is constantly trying to fall apart, and you're trying to hold it together. Now that I'm in my 40s, I can say that with confidence, I know what that feels like. Right? There's this constant conflict. If I don't go and exercise, I will slowly lose my strength. My ability to do stuff is ebbing away piece by piece. At karate just this week, we were doing certain things. We were exercising, and I'm watching these 18-year-olds and 19-year-olds jump and flip and kick. And I realized that I could try it. Actually, you know what? The hard thing about kicking in the air is not jumping and kicking. As a 245-pound man, the hard part about doing a jumping kick is hitting the ground afterwards. Because the ground does not yield. I do. And I'm now at a point in my life where I'm fighting this constant battle against the deterioration of my physical body. And that war, that conflict, that disintegration, that is a signal or a sign to something deeper that's also going on in my mind and my heart. And Jesus comes into the world, and the reason I think he does so many of these miraculous healings is because what Jesus is intending to bring to us on an emotional and relational and intellectual and spiritual level, those things that he's doing, it's often hard to see them. Some people who are the worst in terms of their manners and the way they go about life, and they were never taught to be good citizens or good people like the world would sort of label them. They were never taught that, and yet they met Jesus, and he says, I love you, you can become a child of God if you follow me. And these people who have been rejected by society and find themselves on the outside and don't know all the manners to use and don't know, sometimes even just the basics like personal hygiene. They were never taught that. And yet they met Jesus, and their hearts are transformed. And their minds are transformed. And their lives are changed. But they still use language that if they used it around your kids, you'd cover their ears, right? See, we can't see from the outside what God has been doing on the inside. But you know what? If a young boy dies and his widowed mother is grieving and they're walking to the grave because he was her only son and he's now dead and the funeral procession is going and Jesus comes alongside and he brings that young boy back to life, you cannot deny the power of God in that instant. And that's why he heals the physical hurts. Because he says, you know what? Here's the bad news about that young boy. We have that story in the gospel, right? Where this widow, it's her only son, and they're taking him to his grave. That healing was temporary. I can say with confidence that young man died again. But if that family learned that Jesus was their hope, There is a resurrection coming that will be permanent and glorious. What we long for is peace, and Jesus is the one through whom that peace comes. So your sin and my sin, we talked about this last week. He made him who knew no sin to become sin for us. Jesus dies in my place to win the battle. And he raises Jesus from the dead so that I could live in that victory. And what we long for is this peace that only Jesus can bring. Now, can I give you a word? I want to point something out here. And I hope this is like a balm for your soul. Not a bomb as in boom, explosion. B-A-L-M. An ointment. That's a much less poetic word, ointment. I want to point out that in verse 19 it says, God was pleased to have all his fullness dwell in him. If you are trying to make peace in your own life, and you're doing it on your own, you will fail. You will. You will fail. Can I give, you know what, let's stick, I've already used a physical illustration, let me stick to that. I don't care how many hours you spend at the gym. I don't how many grams of clean protein you eat in a day. I don't care whether you abstain from all sorts of hazardous chemicals. I don't care if you swear off refined sugar. Your life at 20 is going to look different than your life at 40. Your life at 40 is going to look different than your life at 60. Your life at 60 is going to look different than your life at 80.
Okay.
And if you make it to 100, yeah. If you make it to 100, God bless you. But you know what? I don't think you're going to be running marathons at 100. Not likely. Because no matter how hard you fight, there are simple facts about the world in which we live that you cannot overcome. And if we take that down, if we peel that layer back and we look at the heart and the mind and the spirit, and you look at your relationships, I know not a single person, there's not one that I know that has never spoken a word that wounded someone else's heart. That we've all done that is what I'm saying, right? We've all done that. We've all committed to priorities. I'm going to be like this, and I'm not going to go back and be the way I was before. We've all committed to those things, only to find in a few weeks the habits have come back. We have all committed ourselves to other things and stuck to them, only to realize later on they were the things that were killing us all along. You hear success story after success story after success story of people who have made the commitments, and they've reached their goals, and they've achieved them, and they turn around and look what's behind them, and it's nothing but wasted relationships and time that they can't redeem any longer. Because they're left with these prizes in their hands, but they realize that the prizes themselves weren't the valuable things they thought they were. And that what they had sacrificed to get where they were going was way higher than they had originally reckoned the cost. The gospel of Jesus Christ does not say, come to me, try your best, and if you're good enough, I'll welcome you home. That's not the gospel. The gospel of Jesus is not even this. Jesus has saved you. Now it's your job to just try and live up to that. There's only one person for whom it can be said, God was pleased to have all his fullness dwell in him. And that is Jesus. Here's what I want you to take home with you today. Jesus is enough. Trust him. Trust him. He will do things you can't imagine. He will do things beyond your expectation, but you have to trust him. You have to stop trying to organize it by your sort of scheming and planning and plotting. Yeah, go to work and work really, really hard, but trust that the joy and the success and all those other things, they will come as you are faithful to him, and they will come at a time that he has planned, and if they don't come, it's because he had something better for you. Can you trust him that that's what he's doing? Faith is not easy, and it is costly. But it's exactly what we're called to, because only he is big enough to deliver what we need, the peace that we long for. Only Jesus is. And there's an example in Colossians that'll drive this home for us. It drives it home with such clarity. See, Jesus says, come to me and I will change your life. But it's him who transforms us. If you read it in Colossians 3, it says, since then you have been raised with Christ. You have been raised with Christ. Not you climbed your way up. Not that you found your way to the top of the pile. You have been raised with Christ. Now set your hearts on things above, where Christ is seated at the right hand of God. We're called to trust him. We're called to follow him. There's a story that's connected with this letter. If you were to go to the end of the letter in chapter 4, it says that he is coming with Onesimus, your faithful dear brother, who is one of you. Onesimus is an important name. So we have this figure, Onesimus, who is coming home to Colossae. He's coming home to these people where he belongs. And it's fascinating that name is in there. Because if you turn just a few pages in your Bible to the book of Philemon, you'll find out exactly who Onesimus was. See, Onesimus was returning to Colossae, but it was not a grand homecoming. One aspect I hate about going back to my hometown is that they remember who I was when I left. Does that make sense to any of you? Can you identify with that? I wonder, do they remember that conversation we had? Do they remember when I did this idiotic thing? So for some of us going home, it's usually a good thing, but sometimes it comes a little bit of baggage we're carrying. It's nothing compared to what Onesimus knew and saw and experienced. Because we learn, if we read the book of Philemon, that what Onesimus was, he was a slave who had escaped and run away from his master. And in the Roman world, that was essentially a capital crime. You would be put to death if you were a slave who escaped and ran away. But Onesimus somehow ran away from Colossae, went to Rome, where he found and met Paul. And in Rome, we don't know how it happened, we don't have all the details, but what we know is that Onesimus became a believer in Jesus. So now there's a change dynamic. At one point, Onesimus' owner, who was a member of the church in Colossae, Philemon, who's a member of this church, has lost his slave. The slave has run away, and Philemon has every right to demand his execution. Onesimus has run away, found Paul in Rome, and become a believer. And now, instead of a slave and master relationship, we have now experienced this reconciliation that Jesus brings. And Onesimus is now a brother to Philemon. And Paul says, I want you to receive him as a brother. I want you to imagine what Onesimus must have felt like coming back to Colossae. You see, by every right and legal standard and probably personal conviction, Philemon could have demanded Onesimus' life. And I probably would have. Have you ever been hurt by someone and you got to see them pay for what they did to you? Doesn't it feel good? We have that expression, I hope they get what's coming to them. Doesn't it feel good? Especially when it's their own choices. I mean, it's funny when kids do it sometimes, right? You ever seen a little child say, I'm going to go do this, and then they go and do it, and they fall right on their face? Some kids need to learn that way, right? You got to learn the hard way. I can understand why Philemon would want justice done. And Paul says, you know what? There's something bigger than the justice of this world, Philemon. After all, Jesus didn't demand you pay for your crimes. What does Jesus say? Jesus says, I came to set you free. I came to stand in your place. Last week you heard it in 2 Corinthians, right? God made him who knew no sin to become sin for us so that we might become the righteousness of God. Paul writes a letter to Philemon and says, Philemon, your brother is coming home. Receive him as a brother. And that's exactly the peace of God that is available to us in Jesus. That person who hurt you, you have the power to forgive them, whether or not they are sorry or not. Think about that. You've heard the expression, right? Holding a grudge is like drinking poison and expecting your enemies to die. You ever heard that expression before? Sitting there and glaring at them across the aisle. Not that I'm thinking of anyone at this church. But sitting and glaring at them across the aisle. You know the only person who's robbed of peace when you do that? It's you. Jesus says, I can come and bring peace to your heart in a way that will bring radical forgiveness. And slaves and masters who were once enemies with one another can become brothers. And we don't know how this story ended. I find it very unlikely that if Onesimus had been executed by Philemon, they would have left the letter in the Bible. Right? Because they all would have seen it. It would have been obvious to everyone. These aren't there wasn't someone in a dark room writing these stories we have in Scripture. This was a letter to a church. And the church in Colossae would have seen the power of the gospel to bring peace to the hardest, most difficult, most painful situation. And Jesus will do that for you, but you need to trust him. Period. Jesus told a story, and I'll finish with this. He told a story at the end of a huge section of teaching. He said there were two guys working on a construction project. One over on one hill, one over on the other hill. They had the same goal, but different construction projects. One laid a foundation. He understood the landscape, he understood the terrain, he understood the architectural concepts on how to build a house. He laid a foundation, he built his house, and when trouble came and the storm swept across it, it stood firm. But the other guy, his neighbor, was like, let's just get this done quickly. I know what I'm doing. It'll be good enough. I think the story of the man who built his house on the stand, his motto was, that's good enough. And when the rain came, storms blew, the house fell down. You know the difference between those two builders in Jesus' story? Jesus says, this is what it's like when someone hears me, but does not do what I say. The house will collapse. What Jesus wants you to hear this morning, what he wants to trust, here's what he intends for you this morning. That you will trust that he is big enough. His only instruction to you is follow me. Let's pray.